Back in January, Dave Filoni was officially made co-president of Lucasfilm alongside Lin-Manuel Brennan.
Look, it doesn't take a genius to know that any organization thrives when it has two leaders. Go ahead, name a country that doesn't have two presidents. A boat that sets sail without two captains.
Captain gives orders on the ship. The captain of the ship is giving orders.
So for this part of my series on the problems of Star Wars, rather than shouting vaguely at Kathleen Kennedy and Lucasfilm over their mistakes, I'm going to focus more directly on what Filoni needs to know and do if he has any chance of fixing Star Wars. Because, as the new creative lead at Lucasfilm, he is really the only one who can make that happen, and now is the time to do it. The question is, can he do it? Can he fix, or save, as some people call it, Star Wars? To answer that question, we must first ask what is broken with Star Wars. There are a host of superficial answers that immediately come to mind. Bad writing, fumbled legacy characters, low-quality CGI, the sequel trilogy, and so on and so forth. But there are bigger underlying issues, those that deal with capturing the general audience's attention. I've covered two of these in my previous videos in the series, the lack of Star Wars movies since 2019, and the completely mangled timeline. Granted, that first issue is kind of being fixed, with the Mando and Grogu movie this year, followed by Starfighter next year, but because these films don't build on each other, in other words, because they don't address the timeline issue, but instead make it even worse, because of that, just releasing them won't actually solve anything overall. And why is that? Because Lucasfilm doesn't have a long-term game plan, a roadmap like the phases of the MCU. And why is that? It's not just that Disney Leroy Jenkins itself into Star Wars in 2012. No, it's the single biggest core issue Lucasfilm under Kathleen Kennedy suffered from. Lucasfilm does not understand what Star Wars is. Yeah, it's a sci-fi series set in a fictional galaxy full of aliens and physics-defying technology. But what is Star Wars about? What are its core themes, its central tenets? What is the story that George Lucas was telling with the Star Wars galaxy as a backdrop? What makes Star Wars unique? It wasn't just flashy lights and big explosions.
When Star Wars came out, everybody said, oh, it's a silly movie, it's just a bunch of space battles and stuff. It's not real. There's nothing behind it. And I said, well, there is stuff behind it. It's not just a space battle. There's more to it than that. I said, all I wanted to do was tell a story of what happened. You know, it started here and it went there. And it's all about generations, and it's about, you know, the issues of fathers and sons and grandfathers. And it's a family soap opera. I mean, ultimately. I mean, we call it space opera, but people don't realize it's actually a soap opera. And it's all about family problems and that it's not about spaceships.
According to its creator, then, Star Wars is a space opera, which is, as Lucas defines it, a soap opera set in space. So you imagine a regular old soap opera like, say, General Hospital, take that and plonk it onto a spaceship. Star Wars. At its core, Star Wars is the story of the Skywalker family, how the Skywalkers caused the downfall of the Jedi Order and the long-standing Republic, helped form an empire to replace it, then overthrew that empire and created a new Republic, and supposedly a new Jedi Order, at least in the EU. In a sense, the wars in Star Wars refers not just to the big interstellar conflicts, but also the interpersonal and indeed internal conflicts among the characters. Lucas's Star Wars always followed the Skywalkers. They were the main characters. That is the central pillar of Star Wars, and the most basic axiom for describing what Star Wars is. Quite simply, something is Star Wars if it involves or pertains to the Skywalker family, their lives, and their actions. But it's not the only axiom we need. To see why, let's test this first axiom out on some recent Lucasfilm projects to see how much real Star Wars they've made. For example, Andor. Despite not directly featuring any of the Skywalkers, it's very much an integral piece of the Skywalker story because of how involved it is in setting up and motivating the second part of the Skywalker story. If the chain of events we see in Andor doesn't happen, the rebellion never coalesces, the Death Star plans never end up on Tatooine, and Luke probably isn't dragged into the rebellion in time to make his 1 in a million shot at the Death Star, assuming that is even completed on time, again, as shown in Andor. You could say it's a prequel drama to the original trilogy, but it's also entirely reliant on the first part of the Skywalker drama, the prequels. It is very much connected, at both ends and throughout, to the rest of the story. Additionally, Andor more closely maintains the soap opera style of storytelling than any other Star Wars content in the Disney era. It's driven by characters and their stories and relationships. There are even several episodes, particularly in the first season, where it feels like not much happens. but those episodes are developing all the heavily intertwined plotlines, which is very reminiscent of the extremely convoluted and slow-moving relationships in regular long-running daytime soap operas. In stark contrast to that, The Mandalorian initially went for a less serialized, more adventure-of-the-week format. But despite drawing from the old westerns that inspired the original trilogy, and even featuring several sand planets, something Andor did without, under our axiom, The Mandalorian didn't count as Star Wars until it roped in Luke Skywalker at the end of Season 2, finally relating its long-running plot threads to the Skywalker saga, however tangential that may have been. Yet the early shows still seem to capture that Star Wars feel. Now, hang on, you might be saying. How could The Mandalorian feel like Star Wars if the story wasn't? Likewise, how can some people say Andor didn't feel like Star Wars even though its story fundamentally was? Maybe it was the lack of sand planets. Maybe it felt too clean, too polished, or too lacking in familiar locations. Either way, clearly something must be missing from our axiom if both of these shows are to be considered Star Wars. Indeed, there's quite a lot more Star Wars content nowadays than just the story of the Skywalkers, because it gave itself a whole galaxy to expand across. Every background alien in the original movies got a species, a homeworld, and a backstory. Every planet got a history. The Republic, the Jedi Order, and the Sith all got a timeline stretching back to their origins. All this lore sprang up around Star Wars to the point that there's probably more than any single person can know, much like real-world history. And somehow, despite not always featuring the Skywalkers, the books, comics, games, and so on that introduce this lore still feel like they're telling stories inside of Star Wars, and that is because they share the same setting. Indeed, we could say that these stories flesh out the setting initially created for the Skywalker drama. Sure, they're all non-essential for following the main story, which is the only one the general audience sees, but they are clearly related and just as much a part of Star Wars. So that means we now have two axioms. Star Wars is a sci-fi setting in addition to a space opera story. But while the first axiom is very specific to Star Wars, there's only one Luke Skywalker after all, that second axiom is way too simple. We need to define the particular qualities that make the setting of Star Wars unique. After all, just slapping the Star Wars label on a random sci-fi story won't truly make it a Star Wars story. There's more to it than that. And I'm not thinking about the physical setting here, but rather the artistic decisions that shape the physical setting. The physical setting merely enforces the continuity rule that applies to every shared universe. You can't have two things that serve identical roles in the story. In other words, no duplicates, no glitches in the Matrix. Across all of Star Wars, there can only be one capital of the galaxy, one Coruscant, only one Tatooine, only one Millennium Falcon. It's a necessary, if obvious, aspect of the universe that is essential to creating a canon by limiting what new stories can do with existing content, ruling out what-if stories and the like, but really it only prevents two stories from conflicting and says nothing about whether two entirely separate stories can both belong to the same universe. To do that, we need to determine the attributes that comprise the physical setting. This is what I really mean by the setting of Star Wars. And this setting is defined by a particular combination of aesthetic and thematic elements. Star Wars has a unique look and feel in addition to its unique story and characters. Aesthetically, the galaxy is tied together by alien species, spaceship designs, and technology that are common across every project. And this art style can also technically extend to cover meta elements as well, like the opening crawl in the films, the musical genre of the soundtrack, and the overall presentation style used in marketing. Thematically, all the stories, regardless of genre, tone, or exact physical setting, propound the same morals and worldviews, the same life lessons. They may present other views, but they don't endorse them. And yes, Star Wars does have a particular moral slant. It's not amoral like Star Trek used to be, merely presenting different viewpoints without favoring one. This was intentional as part of Lucas's aim to instill spirituality and life lessons in 12-year-old boys. Anyways, the way our second axiom works now is that it's not enough to say a project takes place in the Star Wars galaxy. You have to justify that it fits in the Star Wars setting by ensuring it meets all, yes, all of the aesthetic and thematic criteria we just established. So, overall, a proper Star Wars project is one that matches the look, feel, and themes of the original trilogy and preferably relates to the Skywalker family in some way. That is the Star Wars identity. That is what makes something Star Wars. Of course, all 6 original films fit this identity perfectly. And, as we've already established, so too do Andor and The Mandalorian. But more importantly, Dave Filoni's past works also satisfy these criteria, often by default since he constantly draws on what came before, but that's fine. However, a show like The Acolyte doesn't work. it fails to uphold the thematic elements of Star Wars, preferring to instead showcase a skewed morality that simply doesn't align with the one presented in the rest of the franchise. This is the harshest criticism that can be leveled at that show. No matter how good or bad the writing, acting, and cinematography were, the accolade just doesn't belong to Star Wars. And this is the kind of mistake Lucasfilm needs to avoid going forward, especially for an offshoot film like Starfighter, which, because it won't feature any Skywalkers, is already on thin ice as to whether or not it belongs in the canon. Now, with all that in mind, we can finally return to the original question. Why doesn't Lucasfilm understand Star Wars? And it's simple, because they failed to realize the key ingredients that make Star Wars, Star Wars. So, what can Dave Filoni do to fix Star Wars now that he's in charge? Well, he first needs to learn and keep in mind the axioms we've just discussed so that he can approach all future projects with the right mindset. Then, he needs to plan out a story that adheres to the axioms while developing linearly through the timeline, presenting the story to the audience through a sequence of theatrical films. Sounds simple, right? I mean, it's really not a hard thing to come up with. Many fans across the internet have proposed ideas that would fit right into Star Wars, even if most of them start off with retcon the sequels. The problem is, again, the first step. Filoni, just like Kennedy before him, needs to understand what it means for a project to truly be Star Wars. And while, as I mentioned a moment ago, he seems to at least understand the second axiom, I have my doubts, and I'm going to need to see more Skywalkers and less Ahsoka in future content to be convinced he's on the right path. But to provide practical proof that fixing Star Wars while respecting these criteria is indeed possible, in the next and final part of this series, I'm going to put myself in Dave Filoni's shoes and lay out my own plan for Lucasfilm's future. And rest assured, my approach will be a little more sophisticated than just retcon the sequels. Anyway, this has all just been my very long-winded observation. Maybe you see differently. What do you think Lucasfilm's core problem with Star Wars is? Will following the axioms of Star Wars help them, or is something more missing? And do you think Filoni knows the axioms and will respect them? Leave your thoughts in the comments down below, like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you want to see that last video in this series whenever it should materialize. But above all, thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.